I sat there frozen, the subway's flickering lights casting shadows across my lap as the niece's voice sliced through the train like a blade. "Put her in the cheap seat," she said, loud enough for strangers to laugh. The nephew didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. After raising him, after shielding him from his father's worst nights, after handing over the down payment for his first home, I wasn't family anymore. I was furniture she could rearrange. And he let her. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The subway car jolted hard as it lurched out of the station, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Rachel's voice carried through the rattle of the tracks, sharp and deliberate. "Put her in the cheap seat." Her words sliced through the car with enough volume to make passengers glance up from their phones and papers. A few smirked, unsure if they were witnessing a joke or just some stranger's cruelty. One man gave a little laugh that died when he realized Rachel wasn't laughing at all. She was grinning, smug, mean. Tom shifted in his seat, pretending not to hear. He stared at the advertisement above the opposite window like it was the most interesting thing in the world. His jaw flexed, though, and a faint pulse ticked in his temple. Helen sat beside him, shrinking into herself, one hand locked so tightly around her purse strap that her knuckles blanched. Her lips were pressed together in silence, but the tremor in her other hand betrayed her. She did not look at Rachel. She didn't look at anyone. Across the aisle, Clara leaned forward, her dark brows pulling tight. She fixed Rachel with a stare meant to cut, the kind that asked, "What is wrong with you?" But Rachel didn't meet it. She was too busy thumbing through her phone, the glow lighting up her smirk like a mask she had worn many times before. The subway rocked, and with each sway of the car, the silence between the four of them grew heavier, charged, like the air before a storm. Helen's breath hitched when the train screeched around a curve. She reached for balance, but Tom didn't notice. His hand stayed clenched on his thigh, the knuckles pale. Clara noticed, though. She noticed everything. The stiff line of Helen's shoulders, the calculated cruelty in Rachel's tone, and the way the other passengers quickly looked away, pretending this was none of their business. Clara broke first. "You didn't have to say that." Her voice was steady, quiet enough to sound like a private correction, but sharp enough that Rachel's eyes flicked up from her phone. Rachel tilted her head as if amused. "Excuse me? You heard me?" Clara's voice didn't rise, but the firmness in it carried down the aisle. A man across the way shifted uncomfortably, pretending to focus on his crossword puzzle. Rachel's smirk spread, almost theatrical. "Don't tell me you're offended for her." She jerked her chin at Helen, not even dignifying her with eye contact. "She's used to it." That did it. Helen flinched, a tiny, involuntary twitch, but enough. Clara's breath stilled, then came out slow, measured, as if she were trying to stop herself from lunging across the aisle. "Rachel," Tom muttered, finally speaking, his voice low and raw. "That's enough." But he still didn't look at Helen. Not once. Rachel leaned back against the torn plastic of the subway seat and laughed under her breath, a cruel, airy sound that mingled with the screech of the train brakes. Her phone screen reflected in her eyes as if the world outside this car didn't exist. Helen's grip on her purse eased only when she shifted her gaze to the window, where black tunnels whipped by in streaks. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes watery, mouth trembling with words she refused to release. Clara wanted to reach for her, wanted to say something that would shatter this awful imbalance, but she could feel the invisible lines drawn between them. This wasn't just a rude comment. This was history. Something long, ugly, and rooted deeper than the subway tracks beneath their feet. The car lurched again, throwing everyone slightly sideways. Helen whispered so faint it was barely audible. I don't deserve this. Rachel snorted without looking up. Keep telling yourself that. That was when Clara's restraint cracked. She sat forward, voice cutting through the car. What kind of person talks to someone like that? Seriously, what do you get out of it? The passengers were listening now, though none dared intervene. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Rachel slowly lowered her phone, eyes gleaming with something venomous. She turned her head, finally meeting Clara's stare. You really want to know? She asked. The train screeched, sparks flying briefly outside the windows as it barreled into the next station. Passengers shifted, ready to stand, eager to flee whatever scene was brewing. But Clara didn't blink. She didn't back down. And Rachel leaned closer, her voice dropping just enough to feel like a threat. Because she remembers, and that's enough for me. The subway doors shrieked open. Helen's hand tightened on her purse again. Clara froze, staring, the words sinking deep like poison. Remembers what? The elevator doors slid open with a muted chime, spilling Helen into the hushed hallway of her condo building. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale carpeting, the kind of scent that clung to the place no matter how many times the superintendent scrubbed the floors. She moved down the corridor quickly, her heels clicking in sharp staccato beats, echoing louder than she liked. When she reached her door, she paused. Her hand hovered on the key. The subway ride had left her rattled, as though Rachel's words had lodged themselves in her chest like shards of glass. Even here, miles away from that moment, she could still hear the sneer, "Put her in the cheap seat." Her breath caught. She forced the key into the lock and pushed inside. The condo greeted her with its usual quiet, a sterile, curated neatness that should have been comforting but felt empty. No photographs cluttered the walls, no traces of warmth softened the sharp lines of the furniture. Only silence. She shut the door behind her, dropped her purse on the glass table in the entryway, and stood still, listening. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint tick of the clock in the living room. Her own pulse, too loud in her ears. Helen moved with deliberate care, her body tense as though expecting to find someone waiting inside. She walked straight to the bedroom, sat at the edge of the neatly made bed, and bent forward, staring at the locked drawer in her nightstand. For a long moment she did nothing. Just sat there, breathing shallowly, staring at that small brass lock. Finally, she reached for the key hanging from a thin chain inside her jewelry box. Her fingers shook as she slid it in, turned, and opened the drawer with a soft click. Inside, a stack of envelopes and folders lay arranged in careful order. The top folder was thick, its edges worn from years of handling. Estate documents. She pulled it free, set it on her lap, and opened the cover. Her eyes traveled across the dense text, the notary stamps, the legal jargon that blurred into noise. Then she found the page she always dreaded. The list of heirs. Her throat tightened as she traced the typed names with her finger, and there it was, sharp and undeniable. Rachel. Helen shut her eyes, shaking her head slowly. The paper rustled beneath her hand, that single name as cruel and deliberate as Rachel's voice on the train. Still listed, still untouched. Still binding her to the very person who delighted in tearing her apart in public. Her fingers moved to the signature line, brushing the faint indent of her own handwriting where she had signed all those years ago. She lingered there, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The air in the room seemed to thicken. She tried to inhale, but the breath caught, came shallow and uneven. Why haven't I changed this? She thought. Why did I leave it this way? She closed the folder sharply, the sound loud in the quiet room. For a moment she just stared at it, her hands trembling, her stomach a knot of dread and rage. Finally, with a sudden resolve, Helen stood. She walked across the room, clutching the folder to her chest, and reached for the cordless phone sitting on the nightstand. Her thumb hovered over the keypad, hesitation gnawing at her. But the memory of Rachel's smirk burned too hot. Helen dialed. The line clicked, then rang. Once, twice, 3 times. "Edward, it's Helen." Her voice was taut, almost brittle. She paced across the room, her bare feet whispering against the carpet. "I need to speak with you." "No, not tomorrow. Tonight. Something's wrong. She cut herself off, swallowing. Her eyes fell again to the folder in her hands. "I can't explain over the phone. Just, I need you to come, please." There was silence on the other end, then a low, measured reply. Helen closed her eyes, nodding to words only she could hear. "Yes. Bring the file, all of it." Her voice dropped, almost a whisper now. "I don't care how late it is." She ended the call and stood in the middle of the room, the phone heavy in her hand, the silence pressing closer. From the hallway outside, she thought she heard the faint creak of a floorboard. Her head snapped toward the door. The condo was still. Perfectly still. But Helen's grip tightened around the folder as the unease coiled inside her, cold and certain. She wasn't as alone as she thought. The church basement cafe was quiet in the late afternoon, the hum of its fluorescent lights softened by the faint strains of a choir rehearsing upstairs. Mismatched tables and chairs filled the tiled room, the faint aroma of coffee and overbrewed tea clinging to the air. A corkboard near the door held faded flyers, food drives, AA meetings, grief groups. Helen sat near the back, her coat draped neatly over the chair beside her, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't yet touched. She stared into the dark surface as if it held answers. Clara arrived in a hurry, the door squeaking behind her as she entered. She scanned the room until she spotted Helen, then crossed briskly, her boots clicking against the linoleum. She slid into the seat opposite, her hair slightly damp from the mist outside, her expression already taut with concern. "You look like you haven't slept," Clara said softly. Helen finally lifted her eyes, and for a beat, she didn't answer. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "On the train yesterday, Rachel made a point of humiliating me. Out loud. She told Tom to put me in the cheap seat." The words caught like barbs tearing her throat. Saying them aloud made them real again. Clara's face hardened. Her hand went to the chipped teacup in front of her. The server had dropped it off as she came in, and she gripped it so tight the porcelain clinked against the saucer. Then she slammed it down hard enough to spill some tea across the table. "Cut her off!" The words came out like a verdict. Don't give her another inch. Not a seat, not a cent, not a damn ounce of you. Helen startled slightly at the force of it. Clara wasn't raising her voice, but her intensity filled the room. A couple of volunteers setting up folding chairs for an evening meeting looked over, then quickly looked away. Helen drew in a steady breath, finally lifting her coffee. She sipped slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself grounded her. When she lowered the mug, her voice was calm but threaded with exhaustion. "It isn't that simple." Clara leaned forward, her palms flat on the table. "Helen, it is that simple. People like Rachel don't stop. You can't reason with her. You can't wait for her to grow up or come around. She gets power every time you stay quiet." Helen's gaze drifted toward the small window high on the basement wall. The gray light filtered in, dim and heavy. She thought of the drawer in her condo, of the folder she had pressed to her chest, of Rachel's name typed in neat black ink. Binding. Inescapable. A buzz rattled on the table. Helen's phone. She hesitated, then picked it up. A new text glowed on the screen. Tom. Rachel was joking. Don't overreact. Helen's breath hitched. Her thumb hovered over the phone, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Clara watched her, jaw tightening. "What did he say?" Helen didn't answer. She pressed her thumb against the screen, held it there, and with one sharp motion deleted the message. Gone. She placed the phone face down and finally looked Clara in the eye. There was something new there, something steadier, though her voice trembled as she spoke. She thinks she owns me, even now, even after everything. Clara's expression softened, but her hands remained firm against the table. Then take it back. All of it. Start with that name on the paper. Helen's fingers curled around the mug again. Her chest tightened, a storm rising inside her, equal parts fear and something fiercer. Above them, the choir's voices swelled, spilling faintly through the ceiling, the sound of harmony, aching and pure. But beneath it, Helen heard something else, something that cut through the music and her resolve alike. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the name that flashed across the screen wasn't Tom's, it was Rachel's, and the message preview, stark and jarring, read, "I know what you were looking at last night." Edward's office always smelled faintly of leather and paper. A paneled room in a brick building downtown, it was the sort of space that whispered permanence. Heavy bookshelves sagged with law volumes, their spines lined in gold. The blinds were drawn against the gray daylight, leaving the desk lamp to cast its circle of warmth across thick files stacked in neat towers. Helen sat in the chair across from him, her posture straight, but her hands clenched tight in her lap. Her coffee from earlier still burned faintly in her chest, but it was Rachel's text that haunted her most. "I know what you were looking at last night." She had deleted it, yes, but the words refused to leave. Edward adjusted his glasses, scanning the first page of the will laid flat between them. He was older now, his hair thinning, but his manner hadn't changed. Steady, careful, no wasted motion. He had always been the kind of man who read every line twice. "You said this is urgent," he murmured without looking up. "Tell me what's happened." Helen's throat tightened. She thought of how to phrase it, then let the truth tumble out. "She humiliated me, in front of strangers," she said. Her voice faltered. She pressed her palms together, forcing her breath steady. She said, "I belonged in the cheap seat." Edward's brow lifted slightly, his pen stilled. "On the subway?" Helen gave the smallest nod. For a moment he said nothing. The clock on the wall ticked in the silence. Then Edward leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, his tone shifting into something heavier, more deliberate. "You've let her name remain here, Helen, for years, against my advice." His finger tapped the document. "Is this the moment you're ready to change that?" Helen's gaze fell to the paper, that familiar block of text. Her own signature inked below, a prison of her own making. "I can't carry her on my shoulders anymore," she said finally. "Not when she spits in my face and calls it a joke." Edward nodded once. The decision was made. He drew another folder toward him, opening it with the care of a surgeon. His assistant, Marie, slipped quietly into the office, a seal embosser and notary kit balanced in her hands. She set them on the desk without a word, her presence efficient, almost invisible, like part of the furniture. Edward shuffled the papers into place. "You're choosing a new beneficiary. We'll need a name." Helen's chest rose and fell slowly. For months, years, she had avoided this moment, telling herself it was too messy, too final. But Clara's words had burned a hole through her excuses, cut her off. She lifted her chin. "The Brookfield Literacy Foundation." Edward looked up, meeting her eyes. There was a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected a charitable turn, but he gave a small nod of approval. "Good choice. Solid. They'll appreciate the gift." Helen reached for the pen he slid across the desk. Her hand hovered over the page, her pulse pounding in her ears. She thought of Rachel's smirk, of Tom's text telling her not to overreact, of years of silence swallowed until it made her sick. The pen touched down. The scratch of ink filled the room as she signed her name, steady and deliberate, cutting Rachel out with each stroke. When she set the pen down, Edward turned the page toward Marie. She pressed the embosser firmly, the seal clicking into place with a finality that made Helen's chest tighten. Marie recorded the update, stamping it clean and official. "There," Edward said. His voice was calm, but there was a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. "It's done." Helen exhaled, her fingers trembling. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest rush of relief. A weight lifting, a door unlocked. But just as quickly, unease slid back in. Relief was never safe with Rachel. Not really. Her phone vibrated in her purse, muffled but insistent. Helen's stomach dropped. She already knew who it was before she even reached for it. She glanced at the screen. Another message from Rachel. This one was worse. "You think ink can save you?" The brunch place Rachel picked was one of those self-consciously trendy cafes with Edison bulbs dangling low and waiters in denim aprons who called everyone friend. The chatter of couples and clink of cutlery filled the air, blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. Helen sat across from her niece at the polished wood table, the kind that looked salvaged but cost a fortune. Rachel was already in mid-performance, her voice loud enough for the next table to hear. She leaned back in her chair, mimosa in hand, her laugh cutting sharp through the soft murmur of the cafe. "And when I move into that condo, I'm gutting the kitchen first. Those cabinets? Hideous. And don't get me started on that dining table. It's like stepping into a time capsule." Tom sat beside her, nodding along, though his smile was thin, almost apologetic. He stirred his coffee too long, avoiding Helen's gaze. Helen, meanwhile, cut a neat slice into her omelet. The knife slid through without resistance. She lifted the bite to her mouth, chewing with a composure that looked effortless, but cost her every ounce of control. Rachel reached for the breadbasket, plucking out a croissant and waving it as though it were a prop. "I mean, really, Aunt Helen, you should be thanking me. That place has been begging for someone with a sense of style. Beige walls, lace curtains. It's practically a museum." Helen's hand hovered over her coffee cup. For a fraction of a second, her lips almost curved. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Rachel noticed nothing. She was too busy basking in her own words, sipping her mimosa and leaning close to Tom as if expecting him to back her up. He did, with the smallest, sheepish shrug. "She's not wrong about the cabinets," he muttered. Rachel laughed again, triumphant. Helen sipped her coffee, slow and steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't defend. She didn't rise to the bait. She simply sat in her own silence, letting Rachel fill the space with her bravado. The server passed, refilling water glasses. Rachel brushed him off with a wave, already moving on to plans for her living room, her voice climbing with delight. "I'm thinking a sectional. Something sleek, gray velvet maybe? Oh, and a bar cart right in the corner. We'll throw parties. Actual parties. Not those book club nights you used to have." The dig landed like a dart, but Helen gave no reaction. She lifted her fork, brought another bite of omelet to her lips, and chewed with perfect calm. Inside, her pulse throbbed, but she hid it beneath layers of stillness. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, irritated by the lack of reaction. She wanted sparks. She wanted a fight. Helen offered none. Instead, Helen dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, her eyes dropping briefly to her purse resting against the chair leg. The vibration was faint at first, then persistent. She excused herself with a small gesture, reached down, and drew the phone into her lap. A new voicemail from Edward. She glanced at the screen. Her breath caught. Rachel was still talking, her laughter spilling like champagne. "Oh, and the bedroom? Gone. I'll knock down that wall, expand the closet. Tom deserves a real space for his suits." Not that sad little wardrobe she's kept since. Helen pressed the phone to her ear. Edward's voice filled the silence beneath Rachel's chatter. Calm, steady, precise. Helen, it's done. The foundation is officially your heir. Everything is signed, sealed, recorded. Rachel has no legal claim. Congratulations. Helen lowered the phone, her heart pounding. She slipped it back into her purse without a word. Rachel was still laughing, painting the air with her grand gestures. Tom looked weary, his eyes darting between them, as though sensing something under the surface. Helen lifted her coffee again. This time, she let herself smile, a small, private curve of the lips, hidden behind the rim of the cup. Rachel caught it. Her words faltered mid-sentence. She leaned forward, suspicion flickering in her gaze. What's so funny? Helen set the cup down softly, her face composed, unreadable. Nothing, she said. Her tone was light, almost airy. Nothing at all. But her eyes held something Rachel hadn't seen before. Not fear, not silence, something sharper. Rachel's smirk faltered. The balance of the table shifted. The first thing Helen did when she stepped back inside her condo was pause. Just stand there, in the entryway, with her coat still buttoned and her purse still dangling from her arm, letting her eyes travel across the space. Everything was in order. The polished wood floors caught the winter light spilling through the windows. The cushions on the sofa sat neatly in their places, the lace curtains hung without a wrinkle, and the dining table gleamed with a sheen that spoke of care, not trend. Her condo, still hers. Entirely hers. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. A knock sounded. 3 cheerful raps. Helen startled, then softened when she opened the door to find Clara holding a pie tin wrapped in foil, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Don't you dare tell me you're skipping dessert again, Clara said, brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes. Helen's lips curved. You always bring too much. That's the point. Clara stepped inside, her boots squeaking against the mat. She placed the pie on the counter, peeling off her gloves with a little flourish. Blueberry. Fresh enough considering it's January. You need a bit of sweetness in this place. Helen touched her arm briefly, a gesture of thanks that said more than words could. Clara's smile lingered, warm and steady, before she bustled out again, promising to come back later in the week. When the door closed and the condo returned to its stillness, Helen allowed herself a moment by the window. Outside, snow dusted the streets, softening the hard edges of the city. A child dragged a sled past, bundled in red mittens. A man walked his dog, the leash taut in the wind. For once, the world felt manageable, contained, almost gentle. The phone rang. Helen froze. The sound cut through the condo's quiet like a blade. She crossed to the counter, picked up the receiver, and pressed it to her ear. Rachel's voice spilled through, syrupy but edged. We should redecorate your place, Aunt Helen. Fresh paint, modern lines. I'm thinking bold colors. It's time someone brought your rooms into this century. Helen didn't breathe until the voicemail tone clicked in and the line went dead. She stood still, listening to the silence that followed, her grip tightening on the phone. Without hesitation, she pressed delete. The message vanished into nothing. She set the receiver down carefully as though it were fragile, then turned away. The condo was hers. Rachel could not touch it. Not legally. Not truly. Helen went to the laundry basket in the corner of her bedroom. She pulled out a stack of folded sheets and began sorting them, her movements precise, almost ritualistic. Each crease pressed into place, each corner squared. She hummed under her breath, the melody of a hymn from long ago, something she hadn't sung aloud in years. The sound filled the air, thin but steady. Her hands moved with calm assurance, The rhythm of folding steadied her heartbeat, made her forget the brunch cafe, Rachel's arrogance, Tom's half smile. Made her believe for a fleeting moment that she was safe. Another corner tucked, another sleeve smoothed. But then, a shadow passed outside her window. Quick, human. Helen's humming faltered. She froze, the sheet clutched in her hands, eyes darting toward the glass. Snowflakes swirled against the pane, melting into thin streaks of water. The sidewalk below was empty. No child. No dog. No figure. Only the snow. Helen stood there, still as the furniture Rachel mocked, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The folded sheet slipped from her grasp and landed silently on the floor. The glow of Helen's laptop cut through the dimness of her living room. Outside, the snow had thickened into a steady drift, muting the city's usual roar into a muffled hush. She sat with her back straight against the couch, glasses perched low on her nose, the cursor blinking on her Facebook feed. And there it was, Rachel's latest post. Aunt Helen finally decided to do the right thing. Guess who's inheriting the condo? Can't wait to start renovations. Stay tuned for before and after pics. The photo beneath it showed Rachel leaning against a marble countertop that wasn't even Helen's, holding a glass of champagne, her grin wide and performative. Dozens of likes already, hearts and thumbs rising like confetti. Helen's stomach clenched. The shadow at her window from earlier hadn't rattled her as much as this did. Because this was Rachel's true power. Her performance. Her ability to sell a lie so loudly that it drowned out the truth. The first private message blinked into her inbox. Then another. Then 3 more. Aunt Helen, is it true? Congrats on passing the torch. Rachel says she'll take good care of the place. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Her hand hovered over the keyboard, her breath shallow. She could almost hear Rachel's laugh threading through the wires, smug and taunting. Helen began to type, stopped, deleted, typed again. This time, her words held steady. We'll see. She hit send. A burst of laughter startled her. Clara's, warm and irreverent, spilling through the speaker of Helen's phone. Helen had called her moments earlier, unable to hold the weight of it alone. Let her brag, Clara said, amusement crackling in her voice. She's setting herself up for the fall. That's the thing about Rachel. She can't help announcing her victories before she's won. Let her choke on it later. Helen almost smiled, but it was tight, guarded. It feels like everyone's listening to her. Then make them listen to you, Clara replied firmly. Not with noise, with facts. As if on cue, Helen's inbox pinged with a new email. She clicked it open, her eyes scanning the subject line. Filing confirmation. Last will and testament. It was from Edward. The body of the message was precise, lawyerly. Documents recorded. Changes finalized. Brookfield Literacy Foundation listed as sole beneficiary. Irrevocable. Helen exhaled, her shoulders loosening as though a belt had been unbuckled. She let herself lean back into the couch, her hand resting lightly on the trackpad. The words, irrevocable, glowed in her vision, steadier than any post, any rumor, any lie. Closing the laptop, she stood and moved into the kitchen. The pie Clara had brought earlier sat on the counter, still half wrapped in foil. Next to it, Helen laid out flour, sugar, eggs, butter. The movements were automatic, comforting. Mixing bowl, whisk, the rhythm of creation. Soon the scent of cookies drifted through the condo, warm and familiar, cutting through the sterile edge of the winter air. Helen hummed again, softly, almost the same hymn she had folded laundry to. For the first time in days, her chest eased. She slid the tray into the oven, closed the door with a firm click, and wiped her hands on a towel. The timer ticked softly. Snow fell outside, blanketing the streets, burying footprints. The condo was warm, steady, hers. Then her phone buzzed again on the counter. Helen frowned, wiping her hands before reaching for it. A new notification. Not a text this time. A tag. Rachel had uploaded a new photo. Helen clicked. It was a picture of Helen's condo building. Tonight. Fresh snow visible on the awning, the timestamp marked just minutes ago. The caption read, "Looks cozy in there. Wonder what she's baking." Helen's blood ran cold. The timer ticked on, steady and oblivious. The knock wasn't polite this time. It was a quick rap, 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 followed by the scrape of the latch as the door swung open without waiting for permission. Rachel breezed inside like she owned the place, her coat half off her shoulders, the perfume of something floral and expensive preceding her. Her heels clicked confidently on the hardwood as she tossed the coat over the back of Helen's armchair. Behind her, Tom hovered in the doorway, his face drawn tight. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his whole body carrying the awkward weight of someone who hadn't agreed with this visit, but hadn't stopped it either. Helen stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. The scent of cookies lingered in the air from earlier, but the warmth of it thinned the moment Rachel's voice filled the condo. "Cozy little nest you've got here, Auntie," Rachel drawled, glancing around as if inspecting a property she'd already purchased. "I was just telling Tom. We'll start with the walls. Knock out this one, maybe open up the kitchen. Flow, you know?" Helen didn't flinch. She crossed into the dining area with unhurried steps and placed the towel neatly on the table. "Tea?" she asked, her voice calm, even. Rachel smirked, dropping into one of the chairs as though invited. "Sure, let's christen my future dining room." Tom cleared his throat. "Rachel." But his voice was thin, swallowed by the room. Helen set the kettle on the stove, the hiss of the flame rising beneath it. She laid out cups and saucers, every movement deliberate, her back straight, her hands steady. Rachel leaned back, arms stretched across the chair, her eyes roaming the room with predatory amusement. "You know, Aunt Helen, you should be proud. Not everyone gets to see their things passed down while they're still alive. Consider it a kind of rehearsal." Helen returned with the tray, setting it carefully on the table. The cups clinked softly, the steam curling upward. She poured the tea, her face composed, her hands precise. Rachel lifted her cup, swirling the liquid as if it were wine. "Don't look so stiff. It'll all be ours anyway." She tilted her head toward Tom, flashing him a grin. "Won't it?" Tom's jaw worked, but no words came. Helen reached to the edge of the sideboard, drew out a slim leather folder, and placed it squarely on the table between them. Her fingers brushed the seal embossed in the corner as she slid it across the polished wood toward Rachel. "Read," Helen said softly. Rachel arched a brow, amused, and flipped it open. The amusement faded almost instantly. The papers were crisp, the signatures fresh, the notary stamp pressed deep into the page. Her smirk faltered. Her eyes flicked over the words once, twice, a line forming between her brows. "What is this?" she demanded. Helen sipped her tea before answering. "Facts." Rachel's hands gripped the folder tighter than she meant to. "This foundation, you're leaving it to strangers? After everything I've done for you?" "You've done nothing," Helen interrupted, her voice steady but sharper now, slicing clean through Rachel's outrage. Tom shifted in his chair, his gaze locked on the papers as if they might burn through the table. Rachel laughed, but it was brittle, forced. "You think a piece of paper changes anything? You think—" Helen set her cup down with a quiet click. "It already has." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Rachel's smile twisted, thin as glass about to shatter. She shoved the folder back across the table, the papers sliding out slightly, skewed. Her eyes locked on Helen's, fury flickering just beneath the surface. "You're making a mistake," she hissed, "and you'll regret it." Helen folded her hands, serene, immovable. "We'll see." The kettle whistled faintly in the kitchen, though it had already been poured. The sound bled into the stillness. Rachel pushed back her chair with a sharp scrape, standing too quickly. Tom rose slower, uncertain, caught between them. Helen stayed seated, her gaze unwavering. Rachel reached for her coat, but her voice, low and venomous, cut the air as she slipped it on. "This place won't keep you safe." She turned, heels striking like hammers against the floor, and swept out the door. Tom followed, his eyes lingering on Helen one last time before the latch clicked shut. The condo was quiet again. Too quiet. Helen stared at the folder on the table, the pages slightly ajar, the seal gleaming in the lamplight. And then, a faint sound. From the hallway outside. Not Rachel's heels. Something softer, slower. Like someone hadn't left at all. Helen didn't move at first. She simply sat at the table, hands folded over one another, her gaze fixed on the folder that lay half open before her. The faint sound in the hallway lingered, a ghost of movement. Then the latch rattled again. The door swung open. Rachel stepped back inside, her face taut with something more dangerous than smugness, uncertainty. The confidence that had carried her through every taunt and sneer now cracked at the edges. Tom trailed behind, his eyes flicking from Helen to Rachel, uneasy as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "You can't do that," Rachel said. Her voice caught on the first word, a stumble that betrayed her. "You can't just erase me." Helen rose slowly from her chair, lifting the leather folder and setting it squarely on the table once more. She opened it with deliberate care, her fingers brushing the embossed seal as though polishing its authority. "I can," she said evenly, "and I already did." The stamped paperwork glowed beneath the lamplight, the notary's seal crisp, the ink still bold from the pen. The truth of it sat heavy and undeniable on the page. Rachel's breath hitched, her eyes darting across the text as though it might rearrange itself if she glared hard enough. "No, this isn't legal. You can't cut family out like this. There are laws. Rights. I know there are." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his hands rubbing together. "Maybe we should go, Rachel." His voice was low, placating, but there was no conviction in it. Rachel spun toward him, incredulous. "Go. She's disinheriting me in front of you and you want to go?" Her voice rose, too loud for the small condo. A light chuckle drifted from the doorway. Rachel snapped her head around. Clara leaned casually against the frame, her winter coat still buttoned, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Her eyes gleamed, not unkind, but sharp, assessing. "I told you she'd do it," she said lightly. "Didn't I, Helen?" Helen allowed herself the smallest nod, her composure intact. Clara stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. "You always underestimated her, Rachel. That's the thing about bullies. They mistake silence for weakness." Rachel's face flushed hot, a blotchy red rising to her cheeks. "You think this is funny?" Her voice cracked into a shriek. "Do you think it's fair to toss me aside for some charity no one's ever heard of?" Helen slid the paperwork closer, her hand resting on the stamped corner. Her voice, when it came, was calm as glass. "Life's not always fair." Rachel's mouth fell open. For once, no quick retort came. The silence after Helen's words was thick, absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the wall clock. Tom rubbed his temples, muttering something Helen couldn't quite catch. A fractured attempt to placate both women that dissolved into nothing. Rachel stared at Helen, her hands curling into fists at her sides. She looked like a woman cornered, stripped of her stage, her script torn away. "This isn't over," she whispered finally, her voice raw. "You'll regret this." Helen's expression didn't flicker. "We'll see." Rachel's eyes darted between Helen, the folder, and Clara, who still leaned against the doorway with a half-smile that was equal parts satisfaction and warning. The fury in Rachel's face shifted into something colder. Calculation. She reached for her phone, pulling it from her purse with shaking hands. Her thumbs moved fast across the screen. Helen couldn't see what she typed, but she heard the faint whoosh of a message sent. Seconds later, Helen's phone buzzed on the counter. She didn't need to look. She already knew it was Rachel. Clara stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "You need to leave." Rachel's eyes gleamed, the fury gone, replaced with something more dangerous. Control reclaimed. She turned on her heel, her coat flaring behind her, and swept out into the hallway without another word. Tom followed, his silence heavier than anything he might have said. The condo door shut. Helen reached for her phone. The screen lit up with Rachel's message. It was a photo. Not of the condo, not of Helen, of Edward. Outside his office. Tonight. The text beneath it read, "He won't be so calm when I'm through with him." The phone rang just after dawn. Helen, still in her robe, wrapped the cord tight around her fingers as she pressed the receiver to her ear. "Rachel can scream all she wants." Edward's voice rumbled down the line, steady as granite. "There's no case. None. The will is airtight. She can't undo what's been filed." Helen closed her eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter, the cool edge biting into her hip. "She sent me a picture. Outside your office." Edward exhaled, a long, measured sound. "She wants to rattle you. Don't let her. Let me worry about her antics." Helen stared at the window where the first light touched the lace curtains. The snow outside had crusted into ice overnight, glittering cold and sharp. "She's not going to stop." "No," Edward admitted, "but she won't win." By mid-morning, Rachel's fury had spilled across Facebook like oil. Post after post, angry rants laced with bitterness, tagged with hashtags about family betrayal and greedy foundations, screenshots of legal articles she clearly hadn't read all the way through, vague threats about taking it to court. Helen scrolled through them briefly before shutting the laptop with a decisive click. Her phone chimed with a group message from two distant cousins she hadn't spoken to in years. Is Rachel serious? Again with the drama. We all know how this ends. Helen set the phone aside and reached for her knitting basket. The needles clicked softly, the yarn stretching steady through her fingers. Each stitch was a small anchor, pulling her into rhythm. The chair by the window creaked beneath her, the city hushed outside beneath the frozen weight of winter. She knit while Rachel screamed into the void of her own audience. By evening, Clara arrived, cheeks flushed from the wind, balancing a pie tin in her gloved hands. She kicked off her boots in the entryway and set the dessert down with a flourish. "Cherry this time. Don't say I never give you variety." Helen allowed herself the faintest smile, tugging the yarn into another loop. Clara flopped into the opposite chair, watching Helen's needles with mock seriousness. Knitting through a storm. If that isn't power, I don't know what is. Helen's lips curved, but she didn't answer. Clara leaned forward, voice lowering into the conspiratorial warmth she reserved for her sharpest jabs. "Rachel's rants are comedy at this point. Did you see the one where she called you a dictator of furniture?" Helen's hands paused mid-stitch. Then she gave a quiet, incredulous laugh. It slipped out of her before she could stop it, light but edged with disbelief. Clara grinned, satisfied. "There it is. She's unraveling, Helen. You're not." The oven ticked softly in the kitchen. The faint smell of baked crust wafted through the condo. For a moment, Helen felt the rhythm of normalcy return, the simple domestic pulse that Rachel had tried so hard to rupture. Then her email pinged. She set the needles down and reached for the laptop. A new message glowed in her inbox. Edward's name crisp in the sender line. Subject: all solid. She opened it. Documents filed. Court confirms validity. No contest possible. She's out. Helen let out a long, slow breath. She pressed her hand flat against the keyboard, the words echoing through her chest. Solid. Irrevocable. Safe. Clara raised her teacup in a mock toast. To papers that actually mean something. Helen clinked her own cup gently against it. The warmth spread down her throat as she sipped. Steady. Controlled. But when she set the cup down, her phone buzzed against the table. She glanced at the screen. A new notification. Rachel again. Not a rant this time, not a brag. A photo. The exterior of Helen's condo building. Taken in the dark. Taken just now. And beneath it, the caption. Papers burn. The pounding started just after dusk, rattling the frame of Helen's front door. Not a polite knock, not even Rachel's usual breezy entrance, but a fist hammering in furious rhythm. Helen rose from her chair, her knitting needles clattering onto the side table. Clara, still perched in the kitchen with a slice of cherry pie, froze mid-bite. The pounding stopped. Then Rachel's voice cut through the hallway, shrill and commanding. "Open the door, Helen! I'm moving in. Tonight." Helen's hand tightened around the doorknob, but she didn't turn it. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and unlocked it just enough to pull the door wide a crack. Rachel shoved her palm against the wood, but Helen braced it with her body, blocking the threshold. Rachel stood there in the corridor, her coat half open, her face flushed with fury. Tom hovered a step behind her, his eyes fixed on the floor tiles as though they might swallow him whole. "You heard me," Rachel snapped. "I'm moving in. This condo is mine, whether you like it or not." Helen's voice was low but clear, cutting through Rachel's bluster. "No, Rachel, it isn't." Rachel lunged forward, but Helen didn't budge. Her frame was smaller, but her stance was immovable, steel beneath lace. "Out of my way!" Rachel hissed, shoving harder. "You don't get to slam doors on family. You can wave your little papers around, but that doesn't change what's owed to me." From across the hall, a door creaked open. Mrs. Peterson from 4B peered out, her white hair in curlers, her terrier barking at her feet. Another neighbor leaned halfway into the corridor, phone in hand. The spectacle was drawing eyes. Helen kept her palm pressed firm against the door. "Nothing is owed to you. Not this place. Not me." Rachel's gaze flicked around, realizing the audience. Her voice pitched higher, more dramatic, like a performance staged for the gathering crowd. "She's throwing me into the street. Her own niece." Tom shifted uneasily, still staring at the floor. "Rachel, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Tom," Rachel snapped, her words slicing. Clara appeared quietly at Helen's shoulder, phone angled low, recording the scene. Her expression was calm, almost pleasant, but her eyes glinted with focus. She caught Helen's eye and gave the smallest nod. "We've got this on tape." Rachel's voice rose again, trembling with fury. "You're going to regret this, when the court hears how you're abusing me." But before she could finish, the elevator doors dinged at the end of the hall. Two uniformed officers stepped out, summoned by a neighbor's call. Their radios crackled as they moved briskly toward the commotion. "What seems to be the problem here?" the taller one asked, his voice clipped but even. Rachel whirled toward them, desperate for authority to lean on. "She's locking me out of my own home." She jabbed a finger toward Helen. "I'm her heir. This condo belongs to me, and she's trying to throw me into the street." The officers exchanged a glance. One pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket. The other turned to Helen. "Ma'am?" Helen straightened, her voice calm despite the fire in her chest. "I am the sole owner of this condo, and I have the paperwork to prove it." Clara stepped forward smoothly, extending her phone with the video recording still playing. "You'll want this too," she said. The taller officer held up a hand, addressing Rachel. Do you have any legal documents proving residence or ownership? Rachel's mouth opened and closed. She stammered. She, she changed it. She wasn't supposed to. No documents? The officer pressed. Rachel faltered, her cheeks flaming. She's lying. She, she can't just erase me. The officer shook his head. Ma'am, if you're not on the lease, you have no legal claim to entry. If you force your way in, that's trespassing. The words landed like a gavel. Rachel blinked, stunned, her fury colliding with the weight of law. For once, she had no script. Tom finally lifted his eyes, his voice hoarse. Rachel, let's go. Rachel turned on him, betrayal flashing across her face. Then she looked back at Helen, her expression twisting into something darker, something sharp with promise. This isn't finished, she whispered. The officers flanked her, guiding her back toward the elevator. Neighbors leaned farther out of their doors, murmurs buzzing like static. Helen kept her hands on the doorframe, steady, unshaken. As the officers escorted Rachel away, her voice carried one last venomous echo down the hall. You can't keep me out forever. The latch clicked shut. The hallway hushed. Helen turned to Clara, whose recording was still running, the red dot blinking like a warning light. Clara met her gaze and said softly, "She's planning something bigger." The weight of it pressed into Helen's chest, undeniable. Edward's office was warmer this time. The radiator clanked faintly against the brick wall, and the faint smell of polish clung to the heavy wooden desk. Outside, snow blurred the city into a watercolor of gray and white, but inside everything was sharp, deliberate, final. Helen sat across from Edward once more, her posture straighter than it had been weeks ago. No tremor in her hands, no hesitation in her eyes. Clara sat just behind her, coat still buttoned, a silent force at her back. Edward cleared his throat, sliding a fresh stack of papers across the desk. His spectacles caught the lamplight. "You've already made Rachel ineligible as beneficiary," he said. "But if you want absolute clarity, we file a full replacement. No ambiguities, no loopholes. It will leave no room for challenge." Helen's gaze lingered on the documents. "Do it." Edward leaned back, studying her face. "You're certain?" Helen's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "More than I've ever been." He nodded, then lifted a pen, uncapping it with a soft click. "The Brookfield Literacy Foundation will receive everything. Your condo, your accounts, the lot. Rachel's name will be absent entirely, permanently." Helen reached for the pen. Her fingers wrapped around it with calm authority. She signed the first page, then the second, her script looping firmly across the paper. Each stroke seemed to strip Rachel further from her life. When she set the pen down, Edward turned the documents toward Clara. "We'll need a witness?" Clara stood, stepping closer to the desk. She looked down at Helen before signing, a grin tugging her lips. "There. No one can twist this. Not anymore." The room was silent but charged, the scratch of ink the only sound until Edward gathered the completed papers into a tidy stack. He pressed the notary seal with finality, the embossed mark cutting into the page like a wound and a shield both. "There," he said, pushing the folder back toward Helen. His hand lingered atop it, heavy, firm. "This is binding. Rachel has no claim. None. She is, in every sense, removed." Helen exhaled slowly, her chest rising, her shoulders lowering. For the first time in years, the weight slid from her body like a coat she no longer needed. She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket, and looked at Edward with eyes that gleamed steady and unshaken. "Thank you," she said simply. Edward rose as well, his hand extended across the desk, his grip strong, deliberate. "You've done what had to be done, and you'll be glad for it." Helen smiled, an honest smile, rare and luminous. She gathered her purse, nodded once to Clara, and turned toward the door. The hall beyond seemed brighter, the path clearer. But as she and Clara stepped out of the office, Helen's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She glanced down. A new message. No words this time, just an image. Rachel, standing outside the same building, her face partially shadowed by the snow. And beneath the photo, a single symbol. Helen froze, her breath catching. Clara leaned in to see the screen. The grin faded from her lips. Edward, still inside his office, reached for the blinds, pulling them open just enough to peer out at the street below. His brow furrowed, his hand tightening on the cord. "Did you see her?" Helen whispered. Clara's jaw tightened. "Not yet. But she's here." Edward turned back toward them, his face pale now. "We should move quickly. Very quickly." The folder of papers lay heavy in Helen's arms, the ink barely dry. For the first time, she realized, Rachel didn't need to fight the law. She could fight fire with fire. Literally. Tom's voice came through the line late one evening, low and uneven. Helen held the phone between shoulder and ear while folding towels at the kitchen table, her movements steady, unhurried. "She's not staying with me anymore," he admitted after a long pause. "Rachel, she moved in with a friend. Someone from her office. I couldn't—" His voice cracked, then steadied. "I couldn't take it, the shouting, the threats. I'm sorry, Helen. For all of it." Helen pressed another towel into a neat square. "You don't owe me apologies, Tom." There was silence on the other end, weighted with things he didn't say. She could almost see him. Head bent, jaw tight, shame written into the slope of his shoulders. "She's unraveling," Tom whispered. "I don't know what she's going to do next." Helen's gaze drifted to the window where fresh snow fell soft as ash, muting the street below. She spoke carefully, her tone as even as the folds in her linen. "Then maybe it's time you stop trying to follow her." Tom didn't answer. Only the click of the line ending, abrupt, final. By Sunday, the whispers had reached the church basement. The same cafe where Helen once sat trembling now buzzed with murmurs over steaming cups of coffee and styrofoam plates of pound cake. "Rachel's out," one woman told another, shaking her head. "She thought she had it all lined up. Turns out she doesn't even have a couch to her name." "Moved in with some poor co-worker," another added, voice dripping with relish. "Imagine living like that after all her bragging." The gossip swirled, thick as the smell of instant coffee. Helen sat at her usual table, hands wrapped around her cup, listening but not engaging. Every word was another stitch in a tapestry Rachel had woven for herself. Clara leaned across from her, a wicked little smile tugging her mouth. "They're feasting on her downfall. Let them. For once, you don't have to explain a thing." Helen nodded, taking a sip. She said nothing, but inside, a quiet relief bloomed. A week later, Clara insisted on brunch. Not at one of Rachel's trendy spots, but a small family diner with vinyl booths and chipped mugs of coffee that never emptied. "To new chapters," Clara declared, raising her orange juice like champagne. "And to women who stop letting themselves be trampled." Helen allowed herself a soft laugh as they clinked glasses. The omelets were simple, the kind folded without fanfare, but each bite felt more nourishing than anything she'd eaten in months. For the first time, she wasn't bracing for Rachel's voice to cut across the table. 2 days later, a letter arrived in a cream envelope embossed with the Brookfield Literacy Foundation's seal. Helen opened it slowly, the paper thick beneath her fingertips. "Dear Ms. Walker, on behalf of our board and the generations of readers yet to come, we extend our deepest gratitude for your extraordinary generosity. Your commitment ensures that countless children and adults will find their voices through literacy." The letter went on, full of formal praise and promises. Helen folded it carefully, sliding it into the drawer where she kept the important things, not out of pride, but out of the quiet certainty that it mattered. For once, her name carried something other than Rachel's shadow. By the time the snow began to thaw, Helen knelt in front of her condo building with a trowel in hand, pressing bulbs into the damp earth. Tulips. Yellow and red. Her mother's favorite. Her gloves were damp. Her knees ached, but she worked with steady rhythm. Dirt clinging under her nails. Neighbors passed by with grocery bags and leashed dogs, some offering a wave, others a smile. Helen nodded back, her hands still in the soil. When she finally stood, brushing the dirt from her palms, she looked at the neat row of bulbs, a small promise of spring, a claim of beauty that was hers alone. Clara called from the stoop, holding 2 steaming cups from the diner. "They'll be beautiful, Helen. Just wait." Helen allowed herself a smile, genuine and deep. But as she turned toward the building, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it free, expecting another note from the foundation, maybe a thank you from Edward. Instead, it was a screenshot. Rachel's Facebook post. A single line. "Seats can be taken back." And beneath it, a photo not of Rachel this time, but of Helen, kneeling in the dirt outside her own building. The picture had been taken minutes ago, from across the street. The news arrived not through gossip this time, but in print. Helen sat at her breakfast table, steam curling from her mug, when the headline caught her eye in the business section she rarely read. "Local woman files for bankruptcy protection amid mounting debts." The grainy headshot beside the article left no doubt. Rachel. Her expression was clipped from some earlier event, smiling and bold, but now it sat under a headline that hollowed it out. Helen traced the words with her finger. Bankruptcy. Chapter 13. A list of creditors longer than the obituary page. So that was the seat Rachel had claimed for herself. Not Helen's dining chair, not her living room sofa. A courtroom bench with nothing but debts for company. By week's end, the whispers returned to church, though this time they carried pity laced with disdain. "She maxed out 3 cards," one woman murmured. "Borrowed against her car, too," another added, clucking her tongue. "They always fly too close to the sun, those types." Helen passed by them with her hymnal tucked beneath her arm, neither pausing nor contributing. She no longer needed to. Tom, she heard later through Clara, had quietly moved to a smaller apartment in another part of town. No more hand-wringing, no more chasing Rachel's storm. Just a 1-bedroom, a new job schedule, and, Clara suspected, a sense of relief he hadn't allowed himself before. Helen didn't call him, but she thought of him sometimes, hoping he'd find the steadiness he'd once lacked the courage to claim. At home, Helen cleaned with the soft hum of an old tune in her throat. The vacuum's steady drone passed over her rugs, the lemon scent of polish spread across the wood, and her windows gleamed as though sunlight had taken up permanent residence in the glass. The condo no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like hers again. Each folded sheet in the linen closet, each polished cup on the shelf, was a declaration. She hummed louder when she reached the bedroom, tucking corners of fresh sheets into the mattress with the same precision her mother once taught her. Music rose in her chest, not quite a hymn, not quite a song, just sound, steady and alive. A knock came mid-afternoon, light and familiar. Clara stood there with a bakery box in her arms, cheeks flushed pink against the cold. "Coffee cake," she announced, bustling in before Helen could reply. "And don't try to tell me you're too full. This is medicinal." Helen laughed, an unguarded sound that startled her own ears, and guided Clara toward the table. They ate in companionable silence at first, powdered sugar clinging to their fingers. Clara's eyes twinkled. "You see the papers? Rachel's name printed for everyone to see?" Helen nodded. "It's over for her." Clara's smile was sly but gentle. Over isn't always over, but it's certainly the kind of ending she never imagined. Later that week, another envelope arrived. This one glossy, embossed in bright lettering. The Brookfield Literacy Foundation newsletter. Helen flipped it open and froze. Her own name was there, printed in bold among the benefactors. Helen Walker, patron of literacy. It wasn't boastful, the way Rachel's posts had been. It was steady, understated. But to Helen, it was louder than any of Rachel's proclamations. Her name, at last, tethered to something that mattered. She folded the newsletter and set it gently on the coffee table, not hidden in a drawer this time, out in the open. That evening, the phone rang. Edward's voice filled the line, low and confident as always. "All matters are settled," he said. "Court filings are confirmed. Rachel cannot challenge. The foundation is secure, and so are you." Helen closed her eyes, the words threading warmth through her chest. "Thank you." "You did this," Edward replied firmly. "You took back what was yours." When the call ended, Helen stood at her window, the city lights gleaming against the dusk. For the first time in months, she felt entirely untethered from Rachel's grasp. Free. She turned off the lights, moving toward her bedroom with the calm rhythm of routine. Her hands smoothed the sheets, her slippers patted against the rug. But just before she reached for the lamp, her phone buzzed against the nightstand. No name, no words. Just a single notification. A new account. No profile picture. The message read, "Fire spreads." Helen's hand stilled on the lamp switch. The room, once warm and ordered, felt suddenly brittle. And outside her window, far below on the sidewalk, a figure lingered in the shadow of the streetlight, watching. The subway screeched into the station, doors yawning open with a metallic groan. Helen stepped inside alone this time, her scarf tucked neatly beneath her coat, her purse held lightly at her side. No Tom, no Rachel, no Clara at her shoulder. Just her. The car was half full. Students with backpacks, a man in work boots dozing against the pole, a young mother whispering to her toddler. The usual chorus of city life. Helen didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the very front row, the seat pressed against the window, and sat. The glass was cool against her shoulder, the view stretching forward into the tunnel like a ribbon pulled taut. The same tracks, the same hum of wheels and flicker of fluorescent light. But the weight that once pressed her down was gone. She leaned closer to the glass, catching her reflection. It surprised her. Not the tired, trembling face she'd carried weeks ago. Not the silent shadow Rachel had tried to carve her into. This was sharper, straighter. A woman who had written her own ending in ink Rachel could never erase. Her lips curved. She smiled. The phone in her purse buzzed once. She drew it out, the glow lighting her face as the train rattled forward. "Clara, proud of you." Helen's fingers hovered. She typed 2 words, "Thank you," and hit send. Nothing else needed saying. Clara already knew. A second notification followed, this time an email banner sliding across the screen. The Brookfield Literacy Foundation. She opened it, scanning quickly. Another note of gratitude, another acknowledgement of her gift. "Your name will be printed in our spring gala program. Your generosity ensures new readers every year." Helen exhaled softly. She imagined those tulips outside her building pushing up through the soil, breaking into color when the frost finally lifted. A beginning she wouldn't see every detail of, but one she had made possible all the same. The train rocked gently, the rhythm steady. She let her phone rest in her lap and pressed her palm lightly to the window, the vibration buzzing against her skin. For once, she felt lighter, free. The conductor's voice crackled overhead, muffled and distorted, announcing the next stop. Passengers shifted, rising, clutching their bags. Helen stayed put. She wasn't rushing. Not anymore. Her gaze returned to the window, to the reflection that met her own. She thought of Rachel's sneer, sharp and cruel that day on the train. Put her in the cheap seat. She thought of Tom's silence, of Clara's hand steadying hers, of Edward's seal pressing down with finality. She thought of every moment Rachel had tried to claim her place, her space, her very name. And then she thought of this seat. Hers, chosen, kept. The corners of her mouth lifted again. A smile threaded not with bitterness but with clarity. She whispered, low enough that only the glass caught the sound. She mocked my seat, but I put her out of my will instead. The words settled, final and irrevocable, echoing back at her in the dark reflection. The train roared into the tunnel, sparks flashing briefly along the track like a fuse lit and burning out. Helen didn't look away. She sat taller in her seat and let the city carry her forward.